Okay, so this is, I think, day 7 of this watercolor challenge. So it's the end of the first week. There's almost, the full challenge will be almost 3 weeks, so about a third of the way through. So again, if you've been watching any of the other videos, you'll know that with the landscapes, I tend to start with the sky and I use a sort of wet in wet technique just to get those sort of soft edges on the clouds. So this painting, the goal of this painting was to create a cloudier sort of feeling, maybe a summer's day, but cloudy day, maybe a little bit of light rain or drizzle. And again, like many of my landscapes, it's just a sort of a field or a hillside, and it's done from imagination rather than, well, a combination of imagination and memory rather than going outdoors and doing it from life. So one of the things that I was looking at in the last couple of days was artists who started their career, or their career became somewhat successful later in life. And it was kind of sparked by, well, I guess 2 things. One, I decided to try and become a professional artist in my 50s. And then I was thinking, well, is that maybe too late? I mean, there's people in their 20s and 30s who are trying to do this, and here's me in my 50s trying to do it. Who am I kidding kind of thing. You can't do this in your 50s. But then I thought, well, maybe you can. And has anybody else had a successful art career where they've kind of started in later life? And there are, including some, I guess, quite famous artists who really didn't start to get their career going until, well, in some cases they were quite old. So an example would be a lady called Carmen Herrera. I may be butchering some of the names here, apologies for that. Anyway, she was a painter in New York, and her paintings are kind of I guess, geometrical shapes and minimalism, abstract kind of paintings. She didn't sell her first painting until she was 89 years old. So you could say that her art career got started when she was 89, which I think you agree is, the idea of being old is somewhat relative, but I think most of us can agree that 89 years old is quite old. So in the last I heard, she had made it to 101 years old or so, and she had her sort of retrospective exhibition of some of her artwork. And she's not an isolated case. There are others as well. So another example would be a Japanese artist. Now this is going back over 100 years. And he was an ukiyo-e artist, so a kind of woodblock print artist. And his name was Hokusai Katsushika. And he's probably most famous in the West for a painting, and the name is often translated as The Great Wave. Even if you're not familiar with the name, if you Google it and look at a picture, you'll probably recognize it. It's probably one of the most famous pieces of Japanese art. It's a bit like, say, the Mona Lisa or that type of thing. But anyway, he was in his 50s also before he really started getting into art and making any sort of a living from art. And most of his famous paintings, including The Great Wave, he was in his 70s when he did those. So again, 70 years old or more is, I think most of us agree, that it is quite old. There are others who maybe not just as old, or maybe more, not quite young, maybe middle-aged when they really got going. An example would be Monet, famous French Impressionist artist. He got started when he was a young man, but it was in his 30s when he started actually selling a few paintings, and it wasn't really until he was in his 40s that he really got going and developed that sort of Impressionist style and started really making a living from painting. There are some others as well. Cézanne also. Cézanne was around with the other Impressionists, but he was never really an Impressionist painter. Picasso and Matisse described Cézanne as kind of the father of modern art. The guy who was the link between the older 19th century sort of Impressionism and the more modern 20th century modern art. Cézanne, in his 20s, moved to Paris. He tried to get into several different art schools. None of them would accept him. He tried displaying paintings at the Salon, but again was refused, couldn't get entry. And it wasn't really until his 30s that he started working with, well, especially with, I think, Pissarro, one of the other Impressionist artists, an older artist. And Pissarro helped him develop his style and learn a bit about painting. But certainly Cézanne was well into his 30s or 40s before he started making any real inroads as a career. Actually, Cézanne was a little different from a lot of other artists. His father was very rich. I think his father was a banker, maybe either the manager or owner of a bank. Anyway, he was quite wealthy. And although he didn't like Cézanne being an artist, he didn't think that was a proper job. He did support his son somewhat. So Cézanne never really had to sell paintings in order to survive. He was in a somewhat maybe envious position of he could just sort of do what he wanted, and his father gave him, I suppose, pocket money kind of thing. He gave him an allowance every month or whatever. There was a few other artists maybe in similar positions. There was another Impressionist artist, Sisley, who, again, his father had a very successful business. I think his father and his mother perhaps were English, but Alfred Sisley was born in, I think, Paris, certainly in France, and grew up there and lived his life really in France. So technically he was English, but really he lived in France. But again, he got an income from his father up until the Franco-Prussian War, when his father's business went out of business, and then Sisley had to try and stand on his own 2 feet kind of thing. And he really struggled for the rest of his life. His paintings, although they sold, they didn't really increase in value the way other Impressionists like Monet's paintings did. So in later life he did struggle. Okay, so this is the scan of the final painting. This one, I'm so okay with the final painting. I think, as I said before, with this challenge, trying to produce a painting every day, record it and put it up onto YouTube. There are going to be days when I'm happy with the results and days when maybe I'm not as happy. This is one of the days when I'm maybe not as happy. I say the goal was to produce this idea of maybe a rainy day, a summer's day, but maybe a little bit overcast, a little bit of light rain. It's partly there, but I don't think it's completely what I wanted. But keep going, and hopefully there'll be more successes. Okay, so if you enjoyed today's video, if you'd like to subscribe, just click on the big red button below, and hopefully see you in the next video.